Hello there, everybody. I'm Brian. You probably know me from Milieu Records and Coppice Halifax Records. I don't often make public videos of just myself talking because I'm not very into the camera thing and the online personality thing. But I did want to do this today to talk about my newest record, Suncast, which is a bit of a complicated thing. There's a good bit of exposition and context that goes along with it, and a lot of personal, conceptual type stuff. And, I don't want to patronize my audience by, holding your hand. I'm sure you guys are and girls are up to the task of digesting this thing on your own. But I did feel it was relevant to maybe put something out there that's a bit of information about this thing, just because it's very unlike any of the other literally hundreds of records I've ever done before, in how it's being presented, and that is kind of what I'd like to explain. To start, the Suncast album is actually, I guess you could say, it's mostly the new Milieu record. It's a 21 track album. It's 3 discs long, and I started working on it almost 8 years ago. And for those of you that know my work output and my efficiency with making my own music, 1 year having worked on something would be a really long time for me. So 8 is really, really long. And to explain that, I'll start at the beginning. About 8 years ago, I started work on recording sessions for what was supposed to be the third Ocean Lion album under my Coppice Halifax moniker. And for those of you who aren't familiar with the Ocean Lion series, I started the Ocean Lion series, I want to say about 2008-ish, and it was supposed to be a 4-part set of albums. I did the first 2, and it's kind of a high watermark, pardon the pun, for what I think is some of the best Coppice Halifax material there is. It's very tropically inspired, very dub inspired, very shoegaze inspired. There's a big confluence of influences there that come together in a really interesting way that maybe doesn't happen as much on other Coppice Halifax records. And the second Coppice Halifax Ocean Lion record had a lot of really melodic composition to it, that almost made it feel like it could have been one of those overlapping records with a Milieu record, and I know that they're different projects and they were conceived as such, and most of the time they operate in their own sort of territories, but every now and then there's a record that'll come along, like for example Polly's Island, that could very easily blur the lines between a Milieu album and a Coppice Halifax album. So Ocean Lion 2 established that as kind of a baseline of, well, maybe this is a little bit more of a composed project rather than a more jammy one. Like the first Ocean Lion record was very jammy, very, 4 long tracks, very abstract, kind of like tropical shoegaze gas, if you're into that, for lack of a better description. So there was a big emphasis on the third album, and I didn't really know where I was going with it. And I got into recording for it, and it really quickly, over the course of about a year, became this really, really dense and convoluted project where I was putting so much composition work into it that I began to hit a wall where it was becoming really overly complex, and I felt like it maybe wasn't living up to the ethos of the project Ocean Lion, which should have been more, not, there's composition happening, but it's also very kind of long form and open, and this stuff was way more tight and edited and precise. And so I basically had the realization that I wasn't writing a Coppice Halifax album, I was writing a Milieu album. And once I made that realization, then this project really took a turn for the better. And I spent a couple more years sort of fine-tuning these tracks and taking my time, because I felt that there was something really special about them, melodically and texturally, and it was a really nice sounding record that was going. So then, fast forward a little bit, and my daughter Penelope came into the world. And that sort of made that record and the sessions go on the back burner for a little while, because, you know, to work on this kind of stuff, I need 100% of my mental and creative facilities, and when you have a kid, you're just depleted for like a while. I'm sure some of you understand, but that happened, and I slowly started coming back to it. And by the time I got a bit more steam in the project again, I had a really debilitating hard drive failure in 2016, summer of 2016, and some of you may remember that. I was bumming some money via a charity thing, with the promise of some music for anyone that helped me pay for a data retrieval service at a forensic lab, one of only 4 in the country at the time that did this kind of like undeleting stuff for hard drives. And I sent it to them and paid them the money, and they could only pull off, you know, a fraction of what had been done. Basically, I lost about a year, maybe a year and a half of progress on this album. And this album was particularly the reason why I had such a hard time with the drive crash. Like, I was willing to lose a lot of other things, but this album was sort of the big gem that I didn't want to lose all that progress on. And that was mostly my own fault. I wasn't using cloud upload services and stuff like that at the time. And I have my own reasons for all that. That's a whole other story. But in short, I just kind of had to come to terms with the fact that I lost a whole bunch of progress on this. And because of that fact, I had to just take some more time off of working on this record, because having to go back to kind of really basic versions of some of these songs that were way more fleshed out by the time the drive crashed, it was like kind of going back to like a graveyard or something. I had to give it some time so that I didn't have those negative associations with that material. It was just the wrong mindset to work on it at all. So fast forward a bit more, and it was, we moved up here from South Carolina to the beautiful valley in Dayton, Ohio, in the end of 2016. By then, I had just finished work on what actually became the third Ocean Lion album, kind of pushing that out of the way, because I had already worked out of my mind that whatever this album I was working on was, it wasn't going to be an Ocean Lion record. It was just going to be this other thing. And so I moved up here, set up this new studio that you see behind me, which is kind of a mess right now. I guess it's always a mess, but and that took a bit of time to readjust to this space and get everything set up the way I wanted it and get my gear and workflow going, as well as figuring out what worked in here creatively. I mean, it's a new space, and it took a little bit of adjusting in that way. But I love it here in Ohio. I think it's been really liberating to live in a place that isn't like a subtropical climate. So, so having now been here for a couple years, I have kind of warmed back up to a lot of this stuff, in particular actually enjoying summer weather up here, which was kind of a foreign concept to me when I moved up, because back in South Carolina we had like 90 to 100 degree heat like 9 or 10 months out of the year. The only thing that broke that up was torrential thunderstorms and rain, and it was just a nasty place. It was like living in a jungle. And at best in the autumn and winter and spring months, it would just be more rain and more 80 degree days, which you'd be thankful for, because it wasn't 90 or 100 degree days. But moving up here, everything's very, very, like, there's spring, there's summer, there's fall, there's winter, and it's amazing, and I'm really enjoying it. And so spring and summer start to roll around this year, and I said, you know what, I'm going to finish this record. I can do it this year. Now is the time. It's been going for so long. I have to finish it. So I took the last 2 months and basically at the risk of like not paying any of my utility bills and not attending to any of my other obligations or artistic projects, I focused as much of my creative energy and time on doing this record and finishing it for good. And it took a lot out of me. I've been kind of a space cadet for the last couple months. All my friends know that either I'm talking about this record or I'm just not talking at all, pretty much. So, yeah. So, having finished it over the last couple months, a number of things kind of helped inform how I finished it. And one of the things that went into it was a very unexpected thing that I learned about a very important place in South Carolina. There was, growing up, and this is just another tangent, so you're just going to have to bear with me, but this is how my brain works. Growing up in South Carolina, there was a bridge and a highway that I drove in the car with my family probably multiple times a day, every day at the very least, in this town I lived in called Conway. And there was this huge, next to this bridge, on one side of the highway, there's this huge electric plant that had written in big letters on the side the Dolphus M. Grainger steam and electric plant or something like that, generating station. And as a little kid, as like a little 2 or 3 year old kid who's starting to read and understand words and things like that, I knew that was my last name on this building. And for some reason, I think maybe because of that, and because as a kid, it's, things are so much relatively larger. It was like looking at like a city or something with these 2 huge smokestacks and all the lights and everything. I just sort of got really attached to seeing that all the time. In a way that even as I grew up and got older, it became this sort of hub from which everything in the area was relative to. Like if I thought about how to get somewhere or was giving somebody directions or thinking about any other landmarks in the area or anything, it was all relative to that place. And right across on the other side of the highway from this place was a huge man-made lake, which you may recognize the name of. It was named Lake Busby, which this whole area, like the plant and Lake Busby and everything about that atmosphere, was basically what informed the Coppice Halifax project back in 2006 when I started it. The 1983 album was pretty much like my attempt at like lucid dreaming my way back to that place and synesthetically conjuring it up. Right down to the fact that like the picture that I used for the reissue of 1983 when I put it on a cassette a couple years later was just a shot of this plant and the lake across from it. And so now I'm finishing this record up, and I don't know what led me to go look it up or anything like that. Maybe it was just something on my mind. But I looked into it and I found out, because I hadn't lived in Conway or Myrtle Beach since 2004. So I'm really out of touch with what's actually the state of things where I grew up. But I learned that because the code regulations had changed for this electric plant, that it had to be torn down and just destroyed because they couldn't afford to update the thing to be up to code, I guess. So they tore down the whole plant and drained the Lake Busby across the street, which is now being like cultivated into swampland. And there was just something really kind of affecting about that. I mean, I know a lot of people form attachments to a lot of different types of places and inanimate objects and things like that. But this definitely, I think, helped inform in kind of a weird way a lot about my creative subconscious. Because, I mean, I've always been a creative person, even when I was a little kid. I didn't start playing music or messing with instruments until I was 14, but all through growing up, I was huge into reading and writing and visual art, and You know, for example, I thought for a long, long time that I was going to grow up to be a comic book illustrator. That was my dream job. And then when I turned 14, it was suddenly all about music instead. So, this building and this place, I mean, it was so viscerally part of my my development that I even had a made up word for it when I was like 3 or 4 that my parents didn't even know what I was talking about until they worked out from deduction that that was what I was talking about. And it's a silly thing, but yeah, it was pretty connected to a lot of that stuff. So knowing it was gone kind of gave me this notion that all those times I've gone to that place in my, you know, the mind's eye, creatively, I've effectively like recreated it or saved it in some way, and that and now knowing that it completely doesn't exist, that it's just a big flat lot and a swamp. There's something interesting about the idea that it still exists in this record that I'm finishing up, which was definitely informed by this place. So that was a big part of this, oddly enough. And it may not be obvious. I don't even know if it's wholly relevant to the whole record, but for me, it's in there, and I felt the need to mention it. But more to the point, this record. The reason I'm making this video about this record is because I kind of had the realization working on finishing this material that some of the tracks were in fact Milieu tracks, but some of them were still Coppice Halifax tracks. And to expand on that, I've always felt that while I have these different monikers that are sort of compartmentalized and meant for organizational purposes, and they're very kind of utilitarian, that generally, like, Coppice Halifax is more of a techno project and a dub thing and that kind of stuff, whereas Milieu is much more focused on melodic stuff and acid and brain dance sometimes, and ambient music. And then music under my own name is mostly guitar work or drone or experimental material, things of that nature. I've always sort of thought more along the lines of, I don't tend to want to take credit for the things that I make. I feel like I'm just sort of exploring all this stuff and kind of soaking it up, and I'm the conduit, so to speak, for all this this stuff that's just kind of happening through me. And you know, to make an analogy, like, Milieu and Coppice Halifax are vessels that are all navigating the same sea, and they may all end up in different places and different ports, and some of them may sink and end up on the ocean floor, but they're all in the same space, they're all in the same universe. And so it kind of occurred to me that for the first time in literally hundreds of records, I've made something that I thought truly existed in a state of superposition, like Schrodinger's cat, where this same one record is a Milieu record and it's a Coppice Halifax record. And it's the same record. It's not that it's a Milieu record and the Coppice Halifax section is bonus tracks or remixes or alternative versions of things. It's literally, the first disc is a Milieu album, and as the album continues, the second disc is a Coppice Halifax disc, and then the third disc closes it back up with a Milieu thing. So, and it makes sense. It kind of makes this weird narrative sense, and the way that it flows. It kind of also means, which is why I'm making this video, that I can't split these things up into, like, serial things or volumes. I think it would completely lose the sense of what I'm trying to convey. And so ultimately, I would like everybody to check it out. If you're a fan of Milieu records, particularly things like New Drugs or Color Tone, Swaying Palms, probably a good bit in there because of the tropical influence. as well as if you're a fan of Ocean Lion stuff from Coppice Halifax, or records like High Hawaiian Fog. This album is like an amalgamation of all of that stuff, and right down to certain tracks. Like some of you may have noticed the second single leading up to this record, Green Heat, which is a Milieu single. The first half of that track is almost completely an Analog Botany series Coppice Halifax sounding thing. And then when the switch up comes after the little middle 8 or whatever it is, middle 16, the ending is basically completely in Milieu mode. So it's representing this idea that it exists in both places at the same time while still being a singular idea. And I even toyed with the idea leading up to this of how to frame this, of maybe billing the record as Milieu and Coppice Halifax, the two artists, which it is billed as that. It's I guess you could say a split release. It's not a collaborative thing between these two projects. I mean, I guess in some ways it is because I'm the same guy, but there is a line of delineation there. But I was actually toying with the idea of putting it out with the billing, but then not attributing any of the tracks to either artist, and just leaving it up to you guys to figure out, is this part a Milieu part? Is this a Coppice part? Is it both? Like, what are the percentages? And that would have been an interesting idea to play with. But that makes a confusing thing even more confusing, and I opted out of that idea. So what you're going to get, you're going to know this is the Milieu part, this is the Coppice Halifax part. It's almost presented more like acts in a play, or maybe if you saw a really long movie and there was like a big intermission, you know, the Coppice section in the middle is the intermission. That's very, it's like a bit of a tempo change. You know, maybe it's more like tides or something. You know, it's like high tide, low tide, high tide again, or vice versa. But that's basically the gist of it. And I'm making this video to kind of inform all that a little bit, and hopefully make it not so intimidating. Because I know I put out a lot of music, and it is a lot to ask those of you who mostly just keep up with my Milieu work to now jump onto this huge triple album thing that's, you know, it's going to cost a little bit more than a regular record because there's a lot more on it. And also asking you to, you know, have the endurance of getting through the runtime. I know not everybody has the kind of attention span and the time and the energy to get through really long works. So I'm beginning to feel like this is probably what filmmakers feel like when they make like a 3-hour movie. That they just, it has to be that. It has to be this thing. And it may not be for everybody, and that's fine. I'm always willing to accept that, you know, that's how it goes. But I really do think that this, despite the length, this record has some of my most accessible music on it that I've probably produced in years. And that's not just because I spent 8 years on it. I think it's really more to do with the fact that I've sunken all these strange sort of changes into it. You know, like 3 different studios of work setups and session recordings, and then I became a father somewhere in there, and I moved, and there's all this other stuff informing it in a way that like no other record has ever had that many different things kind of funneling into it the way this one has. And so it's all very special to me, and I hope you like it. I hope you give it a chance. I've got a 3rd single coming out that kind of had to wait until the record came out to announce. The 3rd single for the album is a Coppice Halifax single. Reason being, if I announced a Coppice Halifax single for a forthcoming Milieu record, that would really confuse the hell out of everybody. So there is more Coppice Halifax material on the way from that section of the record. There was a lot recorded for it that didn't make the cut. Mostly because that middle section, I finished the 2 Milieu sections first, and by the time I got to doing the middle section, there was this huge emphasis on continuity then, and I had the basics kind of down narratively about where I wanted it to start and where I wanted it to end. But it was very much like like a skater in the Olympics who has to stick the landing. Like, there's one chance to do this, and you don't want to make the middle section that's sort of the tide change be the tedious part. You don't want to make something that's boring in the middle, because then it doesn't end up justified for being a triple record. It has to it should have been a double album or something like that. And I'm sure there's going to be those of you who feel that way about this. But I definitely think that the people who are into all the different facets of both of those projects, this could be one of your favorite records that I've done. I hope so. I feel like it is. I made a video for the Coppice Halifax single that'll be coming out soon as well. I tried to make videos for the 2 Milieu singles, and I still might in post, but I just got really creatively tapped out and kind of had to just stop. But yeah, so there's that, and also because it's such a special occasion, I drafted the design and the artwork to be done by my good friend Eric Adrian Lee, who you may remember as he makes music as Biathlon, which is great. He does gallery work and paintings that are great. He does amazing design work for labels all around the world, such as Giallo Disco and Death Waltz and Waymay, and just tons of stuff. I mean, he's just a brilliant artist. I can't say enough about him. If you don't know his work, go check him out. I'm going to link to it in the info for this video. He's just a very talented guy. So if you need good design work, go bother him and pay him, because he's amazing. He also started, or I guess kind of started and ran the WR label, Wilru, out of Portland for a while, which was that was where High Hawaiian Fog came from, and a number of my other records, Pacific Opal Hex, Blue Wheatfield, some drone music, White Demon Disco. We did a split 7-inch, he and I. And we even have a band, actually, that nobody's ever heard before. We have a band that, I'm not going to mention the name because we had a name, and now I discovered someone else has that name, and I don't really want to use it, so... But we have a full album recorded of this really deep textural dub techno stuff that I think is great, and I hope we can put that out in the next little bit of time as well. But yeah, it's great to have Eric involved in this. I wouldn't really want anybody else on the record like this doing design work, because even though I know a lot of very talented photographers and designers and other friends of mine who might be able to be up to task for a lot of the stuff I do, Eric has a very specific touch, and I'd say he's pretty synesthetically aware of what the music is supposed to look and feel like, and I'm very happy with that. And so as such, I'm also going to be looking into printing up some short-run poster prints of the artwork. For those of you who are into putting this kind of stuff on your walls, I think it's really worthwhile. Looking forward to doing that too. So, yeah. So definitely check the record out. I'm pre-recording this, so it's not out yet, but by the time it's out, I'm going to post this, and hopefully... if you've had time to sit through a 30-minute video of me sitting here talking in front of a camera, then hopefully you've got time for a triple disc tropical fantasy Milieu Coppice Halifax thing. So yeah, so that's all I really wanted to say. I appreciate you watching. I appreciate you listening. And of course, none of this stuff is really new to the members of the official Milieu Music fan club, who are, I think, 30 people strong at this point, and they're all supporting me over at Patreon, which is an interesting thing. I've only been doing it since late last year. I'm still learning, but it's been great to have a little something extra for the really interested and supportive people. And so I got to thank all of those guys too. All 30 of you have been great. Super cool about everything, and a really big important part of me being able to do this stuff and do ambitious things with it like this. Like, I can't thank them enough. So that's the end of the video. Enjoy it, and and let me know what you think, because when I write music, I don't tend to, and when I put it out, I don't tend to hear a lot of things about it. And obviously people keep buying my records, so either they look really nice on a shelf or they sound good and no one tells me. Or there's something else going on. I don't know, whatever the reasoning is. But I appreciate all the support and the listening, and would love to know what some thoughts are on it. So if you end up picking this up or picking up the 2 singles or 3 singles at Bandcamp, definitely write a little thing in the box at Bandcamp about what you thought, what your favorite track was. That kind of stuff goes a long way with getting the word out about a record that might not have a lot of reach because I'm putting it out at my own label. And also I'd like to know what you think of this crazy thing. But now that that's done and it's out of my system, I can move on to other things. And feel free to tell me what you'd like to see more of in the future as well. I'm always open to suggestions. I've got a lot of things going on, but Suncast is out. Go check it out. Very happy about it. Hope you like it. And thanks for listening. Bye.